Welcome to Voices of Resilience by Silver Screen Family, where we celebrate the remarkable stories of LGBTQIA+ elders. If you're as inspired as we are by these stories, please show your support by clicking the subscribe button below. By subscribing, you'll stay updated with our latest episodes and help us share these invaluable stories with a wider audience. Thank you.
Before we dive into this podcast, we'd like to extend a special thank you to the Bishopsgate Institute for graciously allowing us to film on their premises. We truly appreciate their support in making this series possible.
So they did this event in Piccadilly Circus under Eros, which is the god of love, called male love. And it was at that event that I met Sister Ethel Dreads of Flashback, who was a Sister of Perpetual Indulgence from the Sydney house of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. And we were all like really amazed and surprised that this person had been there. And particularly one of my friends, who is now Mother Mandragoras in Lotus in Purple, said, I must become a Sister of Perpetual Indulgence. There's no two ways about it. And over the period of about probably less than 2 weeks, I was turned into a Sister of Perpetual Indulgence. I became Sister Sic Transit Gloria Swanson. I was born in Chinkford in North London in the early 60s, and that was when Chinkford was part of Essex. So I always say I'm an Essex boy, but they moved the border later. And it was nice because I was living on the edge of Epping Forest, so you had the town, and then you also had the forest which you could play in. So I had a great childhood growing up. It was just brilliant. And I was an only child, and I was a late child because my parents were both in their 40s when they had me. So I think they kind of weren't expecting me to turn up, but I did. I think they tried for me, but then I suddenly appeared. And that had an effect in that all my friends' families, mothers and fathers, were much older than my parents. And also my parents had been in the war. So my dad had actually gone across on D-Day, and my mother had built pontoon bridges in Saunders Shipyard. Which is the kind of thing that 21-year-old girls had to do in those days. And we had a great time I had a great time growing up. There was a really close family. And when I went to school, I had a reasonably, I did pretty well at school as well. And I knew I was gay probably when I was about 12 or something like that. It's very difficult to pinpoint it. And there was sort of like, pashes and no physical stuff happened, but I was quite close to a couple of kids at school, a couple of boys, and had no interest in girls. And I think I probably knew, fairly early on that I was going to be gay. But of course, it was a completely different world from the one we live in now, where there was absolutely no way that you could come out at school or say anything to anybody. So I didn't. And I went off to university, and I had a fling, which was very short at university. The guy involved actually then dropped out of the course and never came back. So it was me. Anyway, so that was that, and I did nothing more about that until I left uni, and I sort of came home, and I think like a lot of young people, when they come home, they really notice the fact that they've had an experience and gone off in their life and done stuff, and now they're living with their parents again, and it's almost like going backwards. So there was really a need for me then to come out. And I remember ringing a lesbian and gay switchboard And I rang them, and you're just like nervous late at night. There's only one phone in the house. We don't have mobile phones and anything like that, of course. So it's late at night, and I'm on the phone like this, and I'm whispering, and I'm saying, I think I'm gay. And this guy said, sorry? And hilarious comment. And he said, sorry. And then there was literally, he went, are you gay? And I said, yes, I am. And he then suggested that I went to the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, which was in Calcross Street in Farringdon. And I always say the London Lesbian and Gay Centre was like this incredible place, which I don't think has been fully kind of acknowledged in certainly the queer history of London, but it was such an important building in my life. In fact, all these institutions like the Gay Switchboard and LLGC. Later on, I went to London Friend. I mean, young people growing up now, they have equivalent organisations, but really for me, these were the most amazing organisations, which we still really had. Got Switchboard, but these others are perhaps falling away. But they were so important because there was nothing else. So I went to the LLGC, and that was probably the first time I'd ever been in a gay space, in a queer space, and was quite at home. I was surprised by how at home I was. And, there was an absence of any information. I met some people that night who, in fact, I never met again, but because I didn't really go back. But I then got hold of Time Out magazine. Now, Time Out magazine ran a gay section. We're talking now 88, 87, something like this. This was almost the only information you could ever lay your hands on in the public domain, so you could actually walk into a shop and buy Time Out. I mean, buying Gay Times would have been unthinkable, but you could walk and buy Time Out and turn to the page, and see what was going on. And it listed, there were so many venues in London, there were so many bars and pubs and clubs then, and they also had lots of community groups. And one of them was London Friend, which ran a group which was called Turning Point. And it described itself as an opportunity for gay men, I think it was gay men only, to meet other gay men in a non-commercial atmosphere, which sounded quite good to me. I thought that's quite something I could do. So I went to this meeting, which I remember was in Upper Street. And I think it was in what was the old Islington, or is the old Islington Town Hall, or the head offices, the council offices. And I remember walking, you have to sort of steel yourself to do this. I remember walking into that room, and there were about 20, 30 people there. They were just sort of talking. I can't even remember what the talk was about. The idea was there was a talk and then there was a social afterwards. I can't remember what they were talking about. But I sat on some tables next to a couple of guys, and this talk happened. And then the guy at the end of the talk, he said, well, we'll go to the Salmon and Compasses pub, which was round the corner. Salmon and Compasses pub, no longer there, of course, like everything else, shut down. But that was the sort of like a more kind of relaxed pub atmosphere for people to socialise in. And the guys next to me said, oh, you going to go to the pub? And I said, yes, I am. So these two guys who were standing next to me actually became very good friends of mine immediately. So within I suppose about 2 weeks of having gone to that group, we were like best buddies and going out everywhere. So we did a complete exploration of the gay scene together. It was a really fascinating and special time, actually, to do that. And I kept going back to London Friend because they would have an event every so often. They had offices in Caledonian Road, and they still do, I don't know. And they used to have all kinds of events, like a chat or a talk, or they would have a discussion group or whatever. And then we'd all end up in this Salmon and Compasses. And it was a very good way to come out. So it really worked for me. And I think, as I say, I'm really lucky that I had that, because I don't think I certainly wouldn't have come out really otherwise. And then there was, of course, the question of telling my parents, who were pretty conservative about the whole thing, as you can imagine. And, I think they adjusted to the fact that I'd come home from uni and I was now going out a lot. But they were starting to worry that I was taking drugs. My first thing my mother said, is it drugs? And no, I had to say, Mum, I'm gay. And she was absolutely horrified. Now, the other thing that was the context is that my father, I picked absolutely the wrong moment. My dad was actually having a nervous breakdown. I mean, he was very ill. And I remember it quite vividly. It was the time of the 1987 storm that swept in October of 87. There was a big storm that swept across the south of England. And I remember that night was the night that I told them while there was a storm happening. So it was a bit of a disaster, actually. And it's one of those things, we had a very close relationship up until that point. But from that point onwards, suddenly it was a very distant relationship because we were no longer able to talk about things. My mother quite bluntly said to me, "We are never going to discuss this." And so I said, "Okay, then that's fine. We won't discuss it." And I got a job because I'd come back from uni and been unemployed. And I got a job, the first job I could get my hands on, which was working for the Inland Revenue, as it was then, the tax office. And that paid me a salary, which meant that I could move out. And I moved out pretty quickly. So I was living then nowadays, when I look back, it's absurd. I was paying something like, I think it was like £150 a month in a place in Holloway. So in the centre of London, you wouldn't even get an hour in a place nowadays for that money. And that was like the first time that I was actually able to, have a gay home, as it were, where gay friends could come and socialise, and that was very sort of transformative for me. And as I was then out on the scene everywhere. I was probably 24, 25, something like that. And it was a very exciting time. At the same time, it was also a very scary time because you had Section 28, you had AIDS and HIV, you had the most horrendous homophobic press. Society was just exceptionally homophobic. So it had to be kept, to keep your lifestyle secret. You couldn't tell people you were working with. You couldn't be open about yourself at all, only with people you trusted. And it was also, as I say, this continuous media onslaught about AIDS people and all that stuff, and plague from God and all this sort of thing. And there was also in London, in fact, around the country, an incredible number of gay bashings, people being murdered as well, and the police making no effort. And it just was building up and up and up. And I remember sort of reading things. I remember when Derek Jarman came out as HIV positive, the screaming press headlines, very, very sort of personally affected me. I remember reading that on the way to heaven, actually. We were in a taxi on the way down to heaven. And I think that was also the same night when we got into heaven. Somebody said that Kenny Everett was there with his boyfriend. And it was like, we were kind of in the middle of things, you know what I mean? So you were sort of reading this dreadful stories, and then you were in a space with, somebody famous who, was maybe still in the closet, but was actually part of the club. We were feeling that there was a sense of connection with that person. And I just felt a bit kind of like, oh, this is all very good, but and I'm having a good time, but is there anything more going on? And then Section 28 was happening. So we're talking now sort of like, I suppose, 1989 sort of time. And I was then working for an accountancy firm where I couldn't be out again. There was no way you could be out in those days, in an accountancy firm in London. And there was there was a murder of an actor, Michael Booth, and that sparked a group of journalists, in fact, gay journalists working for the gay press and in the media, to form the group Outrage. Outrage was a direct action organisation, and they formed that, I think, in May of 1990. And it was all over the gay press. So we had Capital Gay and the Pink Paper and things like that, where everybody was reading these things. And it really made me go, actually, I'd really want to be involved in something like that, because I want to do more than just this party thing that we were doing. So I went, with a friend to one of the meetings, and the meetings took place in the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, so in the basement, and they, I think, were every Thursday. And I remember walking into this room of again, sort of, this sort of coming into a room thing of activists, young, mainly men, who were just absolutely articulate and angry and organised, and there was energy there. And I thought, I don't know anything really about direct action, which is what it was. It was non-violent direct action. And they were doing campaigns where they would target, say, the police, or they would target an organisation which had taken a particularly homophobic stance and so on. I knew nothing about organising that sort of thing, but I did know how to organise offices. So I became part of the administration group, ran the office for Outrage. And Outrage had an office in the LGC. So about the LGC, it was like this. It had the basement room where people would meet. There was like a bar area in the middle. And then there was this 2-3 floors, I think, above it, of offices and meeting spaces and things like that. And it was absolutely the headquarters of gay, later queer politics in London. It's where everybody came. And I think it was absolutely vital for what happened sort of over the early 90s, the activism that went on, because everybody was under one roof. The Outrage office, Outrage had inherited the office of an organisation called Olga, who had been set up to campaign for the repeal of Section 28, effectively. And it was a wide coalition as well. And Outrage and the office it had been one room. They shared the office with ACT UP London. ACT UP London was the AIDS coalition to unleash power, and they were principally campaigning for the rights of AIDS and HIV patients and for treatment and things like this. So ACT UP was in one half of the office and Outrage was in the other. It had been 2 offices, but there had been a wall down the middle. And when they took the wall down, for whatever reason, the carpets didn't quite meet. And so there was literally a line drawn between the 2 organisations. And it was a bit like that. So you had Outrage looking at ACT UP and thinking, you're so loud and unorganised. And ACT UP looking at Outrage saying, you're such media queens. And there was this like energy going on. I was sort of drawn to what ACT UP was doing, and actually made quite a few friends in ACT UP. And I was like really, at that time, and I think it's probably true now, inside campaign organisations, especially gay, lesbian and gay ones, there's a lot of people telling each other exactly what they think about it to each other all the time, arguing, rowing all the time. And then suddenly everybody's like suddenly unified and they would do an event. And then there would be like more rows. And then suddenly they'd be unified and they'd do it. And I loved that. I thought it was such honesty and sort of like, let's just do it. Let's tell each other what we really feel and then go and do something. It was very passionate, very sort of authentic. So I got very involved with the people in ACT UP. The same also in Outrage, I have to say. And after a while, I sort of had a friends group that was kind of a mixture of the two. And Outrage would do, they did a big thing called the Kiss-In in Piccadilly Circus, for example. That was in September of 1990. And that was to protest against the arrest of gay people for gross indecency if they kissed each other in public, gay men. That was a law. If you couldn't actually kiss or hold someone's hand in public without being accused of some kind of breach of the peace. And so they did this event in Piccadilly Circus under Eros, which is the god of love, called male love. And it was at that event that I met Sister Ethel Dreads a Flashback, who was a Sister of Perpetual Indulgence from the Sydney house of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. And we were all like really amazed and surprised that this person had been there. And particularly one of my friends, who is now Mother Mandragora, Salacious in Purple, said, I must become a Sister of Perpetual Indulgence. There's no two ways about it. And over the period of about probably less than 2 weeks, I was turned into a Sister of Perpetual Indulgence. I became Sister Sic Transit Gloria Swanson of the Order of Perpetual Indulgence. And it was actually a combination of people from Outrage and people from ACT UP who had met each other in the LLGC, who actually formed the core of what became the London House. And I was a Sister of Perpetual Indulgence for, I think you don't really give it up. So probably I'm still one, but I was probably doing it actively for about 5 years. And and it was a great time. It was like, I suppose I was 25 or something like that when it started, and it was, basically it was foundational for me. That's that's me. My entire political outlook, my analysis, and everything comes from literally becoming a sister.
Darlings, welcome to a journey that's more dazzling than a Hollywood premiere. Picture a world where you can hear the echoes of great-grandparents' laughter, bear witness to your grandparents' daring adventures, and relive your parents' most cherished moments. This dream is not out of reach. It's the driving force behind Silver Screen Family. They swoop in like modern-day magicians, capturing these priceless memories and weaving them into films that will stand the test of time. These tales aren't mere anecdotes, they're vessels of wisdom and values. Through them, life's lessons are passed down from one generation to the next, a legacy more valuable than the finest jewels. Whether it's overcoming adversity, embracing change, or savoring life's smallest joys, these stories offer insights no classroom could ever replicate. Silver Screen Family is like your family's personal time machine, capturing stories in all their glory. It's like Netflix, but instead of binge-watching shows, you're binge-watching your family's greatest hits. Together, let's create enduring legacies that will touch the hearts of generations to come. Visit silverscreenfamily.com today and let Silver Screen Family help you create a lasting tribute to your loved ones. Don't wait. Start preserving your family memories now.
The Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. Now you might be wondering, who are they? Well, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence are an order of gay male nuns dedicated to the promulgation of universal joy and the expiation of stigmatic guilt through public manifestation and habitual perpetration. So sit back, relax, and let's explore this intriguing subject with Adam.
So the whole of that time was a period when queer politics was really starting. I remember very much in Outrage, a group of the Outrage members went to the States and got in touch with Queer Nation over there, which was a very similar kind of organisation to Outrage. And they came back. It was a bit like Charlton Heston when he comes down from the mountain, sort of with the "I have the truth," with his hairdo and all this thing. It was a bit like that when they came back. Suddenly they were full of queer politics. Suddenly it was about queer politics, queer politics. Now, queer was actually quite a difficult word to use, and many people who were older members of Outrage, and Outrage had, I suppose, every age and every gender, but there were many of them who are actually very, very against using the word queer. I remember one guy came to the meeting and claimed that he was going to set light to himself with a can of petrol if we kept using the word queer. I mean, it's a very famous moment which everybody who was there remembers very well. But I think the important thing to say that if anybody watching it now, watching this video now and talking about queer, they're probably thinking of something else, because they're probably thinking of queer studies, but I'm talking very much about queer politics and the idea of owning your own body and having the rights over your life. And the period, sort of like late 1990 in London, was absolutely when it really exploded in terms of the activists were all engaged in that, and the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, who are, of course, there's Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence all over the world. They're very established in San Francisco. They're very established in Sydney. There hadn't been really a group of sisters in London for quite a while. So when we came along, we kind of, as we say, refounded the London House. And it was very much along the lines of queer politics being sort of like about, and there was kind of like three types of sister as well. There was the political ones, who were the ones I was, about this politics. There were the ones who really like the drag, like dressing up and doing all this stuff. I was a very plain nun. I was very sort of a black and white veil and habit, but others would put on makeup and all the things. And then there was a whole bunch of sisters, which were interesting, who had in some way had some connection with the Catholic Church in the past. So we had actually got some ex-monks and people who've been altar boys, had left the church, but had adopted all of the paraphernalia in their activism, and they were very handy because they could instantly, some of them could write Latin, which was really useful, and also had lots of ideas about how you could subvert Catholic ritual in order to. And the sisters, the idea of the sisters was that they were kind of a self-elected group of people, it has to be said, but their role was actually to facilitate the rituals and bring people together. So the idea of creating community. So in the straight world, obviously there is the church, and there are many other rituals and things that people can go through, marriage and baptism and all these sorts of things. In the gay world, we're excluded in some ways, and so the sisters would say, no, we can, for example, bless your relationship. We can, for example, bless if you move into a new flat. We can bless your Lati. The other thing I have to say is that we didn't use Latin in the London house, we used Polari. So we always used to start all our activities with a hint of what's his name? What's his name? Bruce Forsyth. When he used to say, nice to see you nice, we'd say, how bona Tavadia, dolly old eeks, bona Tavadia, bona, and everybody would shout. And we would then use all of these sort of like jokes and using Polari. We got quite good at it. My Polari has unfortunately faded a little bit, but all our ceremonies and things like that were written in this, Polari being, if anybody doesn't know, a secret gay language, which is kind of descended from Romany and backslang. And actually, when you say bona Tavadia, dolly old eeks, bona is kind of Italian, Latin. Vada, I think Vada means I think that's Romany. If you to see, I'm right. Your dolly is Victorian, meaning nice or sexually attractive, and your eek is your ecaf, which is face backwards. So how bona Tavadia dolly, how nice to see your lovely face. And there's every bit of Polari sort of has some kind of thing. There's books written in Polari. It's something that's been rescued, I think, certainly since the 1990s. Because when we started doing it, I don't think many younger people of my age then, knew anything about it. But the older generation, you often found them talking Polari in pubs and clubs and things like that. And the thing to listen to if anybody's interested is Julian and Sandy from Round the Horn on the BBC, which was my friend Jules and my friend Sandy kind of thing. Albona Tavadia, Mr. Orme. That's where it came. We adopted that, and people loved that. And I really felt that actually we were around for probably about a month, and everybody started saying, "Oh, the sister's coming to that event. The sister's going to be at that demo." It was like the sisters were really wanted or needed by the scene, the gay community, to as we called them, the gay community, not the LGBTQ, but the gay community needed us to be there because we I think fulfilled a function. We were kind of tapping into something, and sisters became very, very successful as a group, always doing naughty things, going on demos. I remember very early on we went on the anti-war, because the Operation Desert Storm or whatever it was called then, the first Gulf War, we went on that demo, and I think people were genuinely surprised to see us. And of course, if you're wearing a habit, you really stand out in a crowd. It was all the cameras could photograph was us on that one. But the point is that we were making the point that gay people, LGBTQ people, they have a stake in society, and they're interested in the same political things that you're interested in. We have a certain amount of solidarity, so I was very much from the activist angle, I think, from a member of the community. And I found with a lot of the things we were doing, we were because we were emulating the Catholic Church. We just needed to sort of occasionally do things that were clearly not Catholic. So we were often very naughty. There was a big issue with Benetton. They had used a picture of a man who was apparently in the process of dying from an AIDS-related illness, surrounded by his family. And we really, there was a general anger about this image being used. ACT UP was leading the campaign against it. And I remember we trashed a Benetton shop in London. I think it was a bit staged on the part of Benetton. I think they thought that it was actually quite good to let us have that opportunity, because we then ran another trashing of a Benetton shop where I think they were actually very much more harsh on us and stopped us from doing it. While we were there, but so we would do these things which would attract the press. Press would always photograph us. We were there deliberately, as it were, to make sure that the cameras were focused on gay rights. So one of the things that we also decided to do was to start canonizing members of the community who we felt had sort of stood up and done amazing things or significant things. And the first person that we chose for that, which was almost a no-brainer, was Derek Jarman, the filmmaker, who had come out as HIV positive about 7 years or even more before he died. And so he lived in the public domain. He was probably the most prominent British person, possibly one person in the world, living with HIV at the time. And we wanted to canonize him. And the way it came about was that he was making a film which was called Edward II. And he made these marvelous films which they deserve to be watched more frequently, I think, than they do get watched. But this one was particularly good because he included in it members of Outrage and the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence in a riot scene, which is in the film, set in the, whatever it is, 14th century or wherever we are, I don't know. Because, of course, it's a gay story. The story of Edward II is that he is in love with Piers Gaveston. And Jarman wanted to reclaim it as a queer story, so he included queer activists. And the sisters were in this scene. There's actually another story, which is slightly, I think I can tell it. So when they were filming this in Elstree, and somebody said, "Did you know that Cliff Richard is in the studio just down the corridor recording an album?" And of course, Cliff Richard, be careful what you say, but let's put it like this: he wasn't at that stage doing any AIDS or HIV benefits. So, Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence went down the corridor, and they thought that perhaps the door would be locked because it was like Cliff Richard. They pushed the door and it was wide open. They just ran in and shouted, "Why don't you do any benefits for lesbian and gay rights or HIV/AIDS and things like this?" And he's sort of there, recording, Mistletoe and Wine, being like this, and they were ushered out. So that was what happened there. And it was all over the press. It was all over the newspapers about how a horde of lesbian and gay activists, some dressed as nuns, invaded his recording studio. Anyway, so while they were doing the filming for Edward II, somebody said to Jarman, "Would you like to be a saint?" And Jarman sort of went, "Of course." So the next thing we knew, we were all getting up very early to drive down to Dungeness, to Prospect Cottage where he lived, and to make him a saint. And we had no idea how you make a saint. One of the sisters, Sister Frigidity of the Nocturnal Emission, who's actually quite a leading writer and thinker, queer thinker, called Ian Lucas, who was at that point my flatmate, wrote this canonization order of service, which we then delivered. So there was 5 sisters turned up, and of course there was no camera phones in those days, so there's hardly any photographs, and there's no film as far as we know of this whole thing. And Jarman we arrived, and Jarman was already sitting in a throne It was like on the beach outside Prospect Cottage in a gold lame robe, which had been made by Sandy Powell, he was working with. Sandy Powell is now multi-Oscar winner couturier for film, and he's in this thing. And this was the robe that was worn by the character, the actor who was playing Edward II in the film. And we canonized him on the beach. We canonized him. He chose the name. He called himself Saint Derek of the Celluloid Knights. And in fact, the local newspaper had apparently ran a headline that said "Saint in Dungeness." So he was delighted to be made a saint. I think he loved it, and he did say in one of his books, he says that it was one of the best days of his life, I think. So I'm very pleased to have been part of that story. And we did canonize some other sisters, other saints as well. So we canonized some of them around. Another Derek, Saint Derek Cohen of Human Bondage, who ran SM Gays for a long time. Bobby Pickering, Saint Bobby of all shapes and sizes, who ran Bulk. They are, in fact, a saintly couple, and they're partners. And then there was people like Lisa Power was sainted. A very important character who's kind of been forgotten, I think, in a lot of histories, but many of us remember him, Martin Corbett, who was actually the coordinator of many political groups. He was always the administrator and organising the meetings and things like that, and he became Saint Martin of the Million Meetings. And we made a point. We had Saint Charlie MacLean, who was an anarchist and lesbian who used to go to Speaker's Corner, and the group was called Hyde Park Sapphics and Gays, and she would speak every weekend at Hyde Park Corner, Speaker's Corner, sort of just campaigning for queer rights, and we canonized her as well. So it was not necessarily about high profile people like Jarman. It was actually about people who've made a contribution to the queer community. And one of the things that the sisters were able to do was to do these ceremonies and to raise awareness of the work of these people. But it's just basically also to cheer everyone up, because we were in the depths of the AIDS and HIV crisis. We were still struggling with an unequal law. And the sisters were really all part of that sort of world, just trying to make it more fun for people, give people a bit of hope, and enable people to perhaps get together and organise. And I think we probably had a maximum of about 60 nuns. I mean, not all at once, but certainly over a period of time, we had quite a lot of them. And I'm very pleased to say that several of us, especially the ones who were involved with Jarman, have been donating our archive, in fact, to the Bishopsgate. And it's live now, so people can come and look at this, I think, remarkable period of history.
Preserve the stories that matter most with silverscreenfamily.com. In the rush of life, the tales of our loved ones can be lost in the sands of time, but not anymore. At Silver Screen Family, we create films of your cherished ones, capturing their unique stories, their laughter, their wisdom. These are not just films, they are timeless keepsakes that will be remembered and cherished forever. Don't let their stories be forgotten. Visit silverscreenfamily.com and let's start filming your legacy today.
Mum was a housekeeper. She came from a little town called Aberfan, which has unfortunately infamous past that it had a great disaster, when her actual school was crushed by a coal tip. This is just a very short little instrumental. It's called Isabel's Waltz, and it's for my mum, who was Isabel Mary Jane.
Visit silverscreenfamily.com today and begin capturing timeless memories before they slip away. Because every life is a story worth telling, and every story deserves to be remembered.
two organisations that were sort of like most in opposition with each other was like Stonewall and Outrage. So Outrage was all about direct action, and Stonewall was all about convincing people, quietly behind the scenes sort of thing. I mean, that was probably completely the wrong kind of characterisation, because in fact there were very radical people in both organisations. But they fell out with each other. So basically, they accused Stonewall of Outrage accused Stonewall of taking over the campaign, and Stonewall accused Outrage of being disorganised and chaotic and disruptive and things like this. And I was the chair of the Pride Trust at that point, and they asked me, Peter Tatchell and Angela Mason, who was the director of Stonewall, said, "Adam, could you I don't think they used the word referee, but it was, could you chair a meeting between us so that we could just raise some of these issues?" Because they were worried about it was going to get out of hand. This was like 6 months after the vote, which was in September. The vote was in May, so it was September, October time. And they both came into the Pride office, and they were both sitting there. The other group on the other side, it was like 4 from each. And I sat in the middle, kind of quite innocently, sort of like, I was kind of the Kofi Annan of this moment. And Outrage brought out a tape recorder, and they turned the tape recorder on. And Angela said, "What's that?" And they said, "We're going to tape this meeting because, we are an open organisation. We don't have a leadership. We have an open meeting at which we need to report back to our membership." And there was a bit of toing and froing about whether they would allow the recording of this meeting or not. So Peter Tatchell's in the room, Angela Mason, other people from Outrage, the chair of Stonewall, and somebody else. And in the end, they agreed that they would record the meeting, but everybody would get a copy of the tape. In other words, there'd be a tape for Stonewall, a tape for Outrage, and a tape for me. And that we wouldn't be, it was like Chatham House rules, we wouldn't be sort of thing. So I think, 30 years later, I can probably start talking a bit about it. It was really the most fascinating meeting, and I have a copy of the tape still. And when you listen to it, you hear absolutely the essence of what was going on at the time in terms of politics, the gay queer politics. You have this approach that Stonewall is taking, which is about the persuasion of the powers that be to change the law because it is actually wrong. It's just like wrong. And then you've got Outrage saying, no, actually, the problem is society is wrong. We have to smash society, and they have to listen to what we've got to say as gay activists. And this is totally the same thing between CHE and the Gay Liberation Front that we've had, and it's not quite the party protest thing. It's more to do with the liberationist point of view and the assimilationist point of view. And that was exactly what Pride had, this sort of banging together of these things all the time. What was really great about that meeting is they all went in there very sort of like opposed to each other. The tape recorder runs, you listen to it, and you hear over the course of this like hour and a half, they start to talk to each other properly, and they come together over something. And we've got to coordinate on that. We've got to coordinate on this. And you're saying, yes, I'll send you a press release. I'll talk to you about this sort of thing. It was very heartening. And it's sort of like one of these moments was like, it really, I think it's one of those, for me, it was a really privileged moment because I was sitting in the room and listening to this happening. And when I re-listened to that recording, I'm really fascinated to hear. It's like a real flashback to that time. And it absolutely captures what we were about, why we were doing it, what was really going on. That's what you need to write about in gay history. I think queer history has got to remember these moments as well. We used to do a lot of work at Pride as well. So the Pride event in London was getting quite big. So 1990, 91. The one that really went huge was 92, which was Euro Pride. And it was enormous in Brockwell Park. And I think that was the year we teamed up with the Gay Bikers Association, and we rode past the march. The march was going down one side of the road and the traffic was still running on the other side of the road. So we all rode pinion on the back of the Gay Bikers' bikes and flew past the march as it was going that way. And that was a great day out, but I've never been more terrified in all my life wearing a full habit. I don't know how fast we were going over the Westway. I mean, it was just unbelievable. I think back now, it was amazing. None of us were just like, a sort of what's the word for it? One of those Isadora Duncan moment into the wheels. But anyway, we did that, and because we also did a bit of fundraising as well. There was a gay football group which was called Stonewall FC, not Stonewall, the lobby group, but Stonewall FC. And we played football against them at Winter Pride, which was actually based in the University of London Union at Mallet Street. They had a sports area, so the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, played this semi-professional football team, and we won. And we drew a big crowd, and the people at Pride were like, oh, this is very interesting, because they thought the sisters were like, whatever, just a bunch of queens flapping about in habits. And they realised that we had so we started getting a bit closer, sort of doing things together. And we did this whole thing happened with Europride. And then the organisation that was running Europride, which was called LAGPOC, which was the Lesbian and Gay Pride Organising Committee Limited, went bankrupt after Europride, and some of them knew me as somebody who was one of the sisters who was organising stuff, and they asked me, because they also knew I was working as an accountant, if I would just have a look at some of the books and see if there was anything they could rescue from LAGPOC. So I did have a look at the books, and there was nothing. It was completely beyond rescue. But then they asked me if I would want to be involved in setting up a new organisation that would take over organising Pride. And that's how I became a director and eventually the treasurer of the Pride Trust, which was a not-for-profit company that was set up. And there was never a charity, but it was set up to run the Pride event from 93 onwards. And that then became my life. So I've got the sisters thing going on in the background, and I was actually sister treasurer. So I would often go to meetings. As we say, we don't say dressed as a nun, we say manifest. I manifested as Sister Gloria at a number of meetings, including with the brewery company that were backing the bars, I remember. Anyway, and do a lot of fundraising. So part of the job was actually doing lots of fundraising, running around London with a bucket, basically, with a group of volunteers sort of going to everywhere, rattling buckets just to get it going. And we made a go of it. So the Pride Trust took over where LAGPOC had left off. A couple of people had been involved in the previous organisation, were also involved in the Pride Trust, and there was an experience. They were experienced about putting on festivals. And the way that Pride worked in those days was there was a big central London march, and then there was a free festival that was taking place in Brockwell Park. It used to be in Kennington, it was moved to Brockwell. And when it moved to Brockwell, it meant that the march was then too long. You couldn't start in central London. You had to have a high-profile march. You couldn't march from central London all the way up to Brockwell Park. It would take too long. So there was a separation between the two. And this is when this annual ritual of the tube journey between the end of the march and Brockwell Park started, this idea of getting on the tube and taking the tubes over. Now, anybody listening to this now today would think this was nothing, but at the time it was such a major thing for all of these queers to be flooding down through, Hyde Park tube station or wherever it was, and taking the trains over, taking over the entire carriage. It's one of my fondest memories of prides from that time. And the marches were quite big. I mean, there were 50,000 people or so like that on it. My job as the finance person was basically to just ring people up all the time and ask them to give us money, because we had food, we sold food concessions at the event, we sold market trader concessions at the event, we did all the drinks and bars and things like that individually. So people weren't, should we say, as diligent about paying up sometimes as they could have been. And so it was quite nerve-wracking to run this event. But the 93 festival in Brockwell Park, which was our first one, went so smoothly we couldn't believe it. In fact, I think we had something like 120,000 people there. So it was a big event, and it ran for about 10 hours. And the march was in the region of about 40,000 people as well. So it was a big event. And it was, I think, at that point had crossed into being probably Europe's largest lesbian and gay pride event. What was in the background on that one, though, was a bit unpleasant, which was that there'd been a series of serial killings. And this guy who they eventually caught had murdered or strangled pickups that he'd had in London. I think 5 young men were murdered in the immediate run-up to the Pride event. And the problem with Pride is that it doesn't matter how big it is, the mainstream press always completely ignored it. They would never report it. The only thing they would ever really report was that there was a demonstration going through central London and there was a problem with the traffic. That was really all they ever got to. But with this one, suddenly there was this national story of this serial killer, which they had uncovered. And the police decided to use the Pride event as an opportunity to ask for information. And so obviously we had kind of the Metropolitan Police PR team effectively doing this work for us. And they told the story of the Pride event perfectly well. It was beautifully done. It was like everybody knew what Pride was all about and that it actually happened and that it was a big event. It was on all the television channels. That was a real breakthrough, that 93 event, I think, for the wrong reasons, of course. As I say, they did eventually catch the guy and he's serving his time. So it was quite a baptism of fire to have to put an event on and at the same time deal with this massive press. There was only one phone line in the Pride office, I remember, and it was like constantly ringing off the hook with inquiries from the press who thought that the event, some of them had thought the event had been put on as a way of protesting the serial killer. And then we had to explain to them, no, this is a tradition which has actually been running since about 1972. You know, it's like, come on. So, actually before then, I think 1970. I can't remember. So it was an interesting time for us, indeed. And because that event was such a success, we were able to organise the one for 94. And it was at that point that I then became the chair of the Pride Trust. So I became the Pride chair, and I was the Pride chair between 93 and 96. And that was a period of incredible growth for the festival, which was a completely free event. We asked people to give donations when they came into the park, and the donations went steadily up over the years. I was the chair. Never completely paid for everything, but I mean, it was a big contribution. And the event itself, I think, because it became so big, it started to sort of take on a life of its own. There were a lot of people commenting on it, I think would be the right. And there's always people commenting on Pride. You can't get away from that. But the 94 event was a really interesting one because it was the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riot. So we really had to do a good one. It was one of the things we decided. It was also the year of the vote for the age of consent, the equal age of consent for gay men, which was in February of that year. And Stonewall, the lobby group, which is, I think we have to just also say that Stonewall then was very different from the Stonewall now. Then they were very much a lobby group that was working with parliamentarians to change the law. They formed a coalition of activist organisations. So it included Outrage, ACT UP, included Gallup, the Gay Policing Initiative, and people like that, to campaign for a change to the law to equalise the age of consent for gay men at 16 with straight men. And the way they were going to do it was to make an amendment to the Criminal Justice Bill. And we called it the CJB. And the problem with that was the CJB was actually full of things which we didn't like, including stopping campaigns and demonstrations and limiting people's rights to protest and things like that. But nevertheless, everybody got behind the campaign. And it started to come to a head that there was then scheduled a parliamentary vote. And I think it was 2 days before the parliamentary vote, Derek Jarman died. And he died, I think on something like the 21st of February or something like that. And the vote was like 2 or 3 days later. And so there was very quickly organised a vigil for Derek Jarman that gathered outside the House of Parliament on the night of the vote, and I was in the crowd. And it was a very peaceful gathering. We all had candles and things like that, but we knew that there was parliamentary debate was going on inside the House. Now, of course, again, nobody had a mobile phone. There was no such thing as 24-hour rolling news. Nobody knew what was going on. We could just hear rumours coming back through the crowd about who was speaking and what was being said in the House. The thing was, we were all outside, and we just started chanting, and we just got very rowdy as a crowd. And I remember vividly Stonewall, who were trying to keep everything under control. Let's just have a nice quiet vote and get it through, kind of thing. Going around the crowd and saying, could you just keep it quiet like this? And that just made us more angry, and we started making even more noise. Anyway, so in the end, there was a vote, and the vote was very narrow, but it was a defeat for the equal age of consent, and instead the amendment, which had been brought by somebody else for the age of consent at 18, was brought in. And everybody was really angry. The news came through the crowd. I could remember it quite vividly, coming through the crowd, people hearing that this had happened. And people just started shouting. And we crossed the road and actually rushed on Parliament. It's apparently one of the rare occasions that this has ever happened, that there has been some kind of riot on the House of Parliament. And it didn't last very long. It petered out, actually. And I remember walking home after that and running into Robin Cook, a member of the Labour Party, who was later the Foreign Secretary. And he sort of told us what had been said and what had happened inside the House as we were walking with him back to the tube station. And then when I got home, of course, I listened to it on the radio, and I hear that there's been a riot in Parliament of angry queer people who were angry about the way in which the state has voted against equal age of consent, which I thought was a bit overdone. But it was really very interesting as a moment for the whole LGBT community to just remember that this thing had happened spontaneously outside the House of Parliament. And so the campaign was ultimately a kind of half win. It didn't really win, but it sort of did. And so we also had, therefore, a very politicized atmosphere for the Pride event in '94. So actually it was all about, how can we win our rights? And as the chair of the event, it's the 25th anniversary of Stonewall. I've got to get the organisation to do a good job. That was what I felt. And one of the things we really needed was to have a very high-profile London march, because you couldn't just go down the back streets, as they would like us to do. So we wanted to march past Downing Street and the Houses of Parliament, and the police blocked us. And then we were locked in a series of negotiations with them that must have lasted well into April, I think, where they just wouldn't budge. But in the end, we came up with some compromise ideas about how the issue was that they just didn't want the march. They claimed they didn't want the march to disperse into the streets. They wanted it to disperse into a green space. So they always loved it to go to Jubilee Gardens or something like that. And we said, no, we want it to go it's got to go into Parliament Square, and you can't disperse a march in Parliament Square. So in the end, we agreed a compromise where the dispersal actually did take place in the streets, and our job was to manage that dispersal. The route went down Piccadilly, came out of Hyde Park, down Park Lane, Piccadilly, through Eros, through Trafalgar Square, part of it, and then down Whitehall, past Downing Street, and then round the wrong way, this was the clever bit, round the wrong way, round Parliament Square, and then dispersed somewhere behind Westminster Abbey. And it was a very, very high-profile march. It was probably one of the most high-profile marches that the police would allow in London. And we kept that route for, I think it must have been 5 or 6 years. And I don't know whether it's ever been used again. I don't know whether the police would allow it now. But it was for us, I think it was a huge success. And we felt really the support of the gay press, which we didn't always feel in Pride, but we certainly felt the support of the gay press while we were campaigning for that. And that march, it was in the region of, again, about 50 to 60,000 people, and a huge success it was too. And the event was still in Brockwell Park, and it was fine, but it was quite clear that it was too big for Brockwell Park now. So we had to move it somewhere else. So as the chair, I had to oversee a whole secret series of meetings about where it would go. And the upshot of that was that it moved to Victoria Park in East London for the 95 event. The 95 event was very interesting, I think, because we decided that one of the things that Pride had not done properly was address the needs of women in the gay community, that lesbians needed to be given more of a platform at the event. And so we deliberately themed, if that's the right word, the event around lesbian visibility and brought in a whole group of new, younger lesbian activists, kinds that had really sort of come through the outrage route. And there was also a big a group that had started, which was called the Lesbian Avengers, which copied on the American organization. Many of them were involved in the Pride event and the organizing of it in 1995. I think it actually went very well, but I think the problem with Pride is that it always reverts to the norm for a period of time. And so after a while, people dropped out again, and we went back to where we had been. I don't think it was like, looking back on it now, I don't think we embedded that as well as we could have done. Although Pride did end up with a female chair after me. And that was it was all a very interesting period as well, because you could quite feel with this high point of the age of consent campaign, this sort of like people's energies in terms of politics, the energy level of the whole LGBT community was just like falling away for the second half of the 90s. It was really, really noticeable. You know, the membership of some of these groups got very small. The issues, you know, the press moved in a different direction. So suddenly we had lots of lifestyle. Boys magazine came out. Everything was about lifestyle. It was pubs and clubs and facial scrubs, I think somebody called it. That's what it was all about, you know, rather than it being about gay rights and things like that. There was like a lifestyle thing. And actually, this is something that's really, I think, a really important point also to make about the 1990s. We had the queer politics and the energy there, but there was also this incredible economic growth for the queer community. I mean, the Pink Pound was a thing which was basically straight organisations realising they could market to queer people. But actually, there was also a big increase in the number of gay-run businesses, a lot of organised. And there was also, especially around Soho, the creation of Soho, Compton Street, all the pubs and clubs and things that were going on there, the businesses that served it. They were all called Freedom something. There was Freedom Bar, and there was Freedom Cafe, and there was Freedom Cars, and there was, I don't know, Freedom Fair, which was actually a lifestyle fair, like a kind of ideal homo exhibition, as it was called. You know, this was like an equal thing that was happening at the same time. And you always felt this tension in Pride as well. People were always talking about, you know, is Pride protest, or has it become too corporate? I mean, if you look at the history of Pride events, as I've done, you can see that is the thing that happens all the time. They're always talking about whether has it lost its heart because it's become like a company and a business. And I mean, I was always very committed as a protester, a campaigner, that it would be a political thing. And also I was very committed to the festival not having a fee. So when you went into it, you would pay perhaps a donation if you could, but I didn't want it to be like you had to pay to be gay, like, you know, like a Doors on the Underground or something like that. I didn't want any of that stuff. And funnily enough, we did have a number of internal rows about whether we should move to a paid model about it. And I kind of won that campaign. And now looking back on it, I realized that actually sealed the fate of the organization, because it was not possible to actually, that was not a business plan. You really, realistically, when it got to that size, it ought to have had some kind of entry fee or some kind of fee for it. And we knew that as we were sort of heading towards 96, 97. The 97 event was the last one. In 96, that the Pride organisers did, I was the chair of the Pride Trust for the 96 event, but I knew that the organisation was going to have to embrace some kind of ticketing arrangement, and I really didn't want to be the chair for that. So I retired from the chair in 96, although I stayed on the committee. And we didn't need to put a ticketed event in place for 97, but we, after the event in Victoria Park in 95, again, it was too small. And there was also some violence on the site and also around the site after the Pride event, which we were very concerned about. There'd been some gay bashing happening. And so we thought, rather that we didn't want to make a big thing about that because we didn't want to stigmatise East London as being homophobic, but we did feel that it would be better to move back into Lambeth. And that's when Clapham Common became available for us. And so the events that we did in 96 and 97 were in Clapham Common. And then you could feel this sort of turning point, really, I think, because they got very big. So the 97 event was, I think it was like 300,000 people. It was twice the size of Glastonbury Festival. I mean, it was huge, and we were just about in control, I think. And I think probably in 97, we were probably very much in some places not in control. But there was always a safe event. We never had any major incidents of any kind. It was always a very easy event to run. I think the police found it very easy to look after us, and they never charged us a penny for any activity that they did. It was just straightforward policing the streets and so on. But it was like really feeling this sort of turning point happening in the community where, all right, this is a huge event, but it looks like it's like a huge commercial festival. And then people were complaining that, it's been swamped by straight people. There's lots of straight people at this event. Another thing that happened in 96, which I think was really significant, is we changed the name of the event. We called it Lesbian and Gay, Bisexual and Transgender. And I'm very proud to be the chair of the organisation that changed it to that, because I think we did exactly the right thing. It's quite interesting. When the Pride Trust stopped producing the festival, it actually went back to being just Lesbian and Gay Pride. From there on, Lesbian and Gay Mardi Gras, I think it was called. But in 1996, I really felt suddenly the political side of it was just becoming a little bit less, the political side of the community was becoming less and less and less. And I put it down to the fact that everybody knew that Tony Blair and Labour Party were heading in our direction, and that there would be an election, and then our rights would be transformed as a result. And I just think people probably sat back a bit. It's very difficult to tell. The Pride Trust's stock in trade was these big events that would be like mass events on the streets, campaigns showing as many people as possible. People going, yeah, we don't need that really anymore. What we really want is to have smaller events and more personal, kind of things like this. So I think there was a subtle change of need at that point. And we entered into the 97 event, into that year, knowing that Tony Blair was probably going to be the Prime Minister. We had lots of chats with the Labour Party, especially with Chris Smith, who was eventually going to be the first out gay cabinet minister as the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. But back then he was just an MP, as it were. And we were talking to them about using Hyde Park as a venue, potentially. Hyde Park rejected every attempt that we had to suggest that we could use them. They had a big event I think it was at the time of the VE Day celebrations, if I'm right, which was a huge event. And they'd written us a letter saying, Hyde Park is not suitable for big events. And then there was like VE Day, which was like this thing. I'm saying, oh yeah, what about this? They also then said to us, we don't feel that Pride is the kind of event that should be appearing in Hyde Park, in a Royal Park setting, I think is what they said. And then we showed them videos of the 1979 Pride that actually took place in Hyde Park when there was a stage, and also Tom Robinson was the compere. So in fact, it had been there in the past. It was a very amusing series of letters. And from this, we were thinking about how could we do an event, and we thought maybe we'd bring back Europride for the 1999 festival. And knowing in our heads and hoping that there would be a change of government, and therefore Mr. Chris Smith would be the person in charge of that responsibility because he had responsibility for the Royal Parks, and he could then make the decision to say yes, etc., etc. We also knew that it would have to become a paying event. So that's something that was clearly happening. It would have to probably happen in 98 or 99. And then, we just thought, let's just hold on to this and move it forward. The 97 event was a big success. It did everything that we wanted it to do. It was super good because, of course, in May of 97, Tony Blair wins the general election. New Labour is in charge. One of the greatest moments of my life is to take Chris Smith to the backstage of the Pride event and have him walk out onto the stage to address the crowd as the first out gay cabinet minister. Great moment. Then we realised we'd actually forgotten to organise a taxi, so I had to take him and his partner Dorian and run outside the park and flag down a cab in Clapham and get him so he could go off to his next event. But truly a great moment. I mean, really quite pivotal and different. And we thought we'd done it. We thought we'd pulled it off. I was still on the committee. I was the deputy chair then. And I saw all the finances and it all looked fine. The festival director left to take up a job actually running the event in San Francisco. We thought we'd met all of our income targets and paid off all the old debts, including the debts from this year. And then suddenly more bills started arriving. And we had more bills. I think in the end, we had about £80,000 worth of extra expenditure on top of what we'd ordered. And the other thing, which was a real kick in the pants, was that we were on Clapham Common. You had to have a fence around it. The fence hadn't been completed on the day, and so a lot of stuff had been stolen from the festival site. I mean, like big stuff, like people had towed away generators and things like that. But because the fence was not completed, it invalidated our insurance, and that was like another £40,000 of cost. I mean, this event was huge. I mean, there's no, that's just what happened. And then there were some other odd bits and pieces, including overheads costs and things like that. And in the end, we actually had a deficit of about £168,000 or something, which was not in itself, I mean, given that we had a turnover of about 750,000, was not actually that severe. And we'd been in worse situations. I mean, we'd really scraped through on a couple of years. But I just think that, as I say, the community had kind of decided, no, actually, we don't want that kind of event anymore. We're looking for something else. And I couldn't, using all my contacts, etc., drum up the support that was needed to actually rescue it. And although we did go through a exercise where somebody said, "I will, if you give me the right to organise Pride, I will pay off some of those debts." And we got to the point where we put together an application to use Clapham Common for 1998. But a group of business people who had obviously thought to themselves, well, it's got to be a paid event. There's a Secretary of State who's quite interested in this event, and it might move to Hyde Park. There's a strong possibility that the community likes the idea of a paid event as well. Just going back, one thing that we did do in 97, because everybody's saying, oh, it's all the straight people swamping this event and making it too big. We did a little survey, and in the survey, we obviously asked them to identify themselves, and I think 16% of the survey group, which was like 2,000, it was a survey run by South Bank University, and they surveyed 2,000 people on site, so it was a proper pucker survey. About 16% of them identified as heterosexual, and of that, I think maybe 3% of them were male. So in fact, it was mainly women identifying as heterosexual. That's quite a small percentage, actually, given the fact that everybody said it was swamped. And the point is that it wasn't, I think it's so important to say it, because it grew because of queer people came to the event, not because straight people filled it up. It was actually a queer festival and got big in that way. And, in the questionnaire, we also asked, do you think Pride should be a protest or a party? And apparently those over the age of 35 were more inclined to say it was a political event, which I think was very interesting. I wonder if you did the same survey now, if it would actually be the ones under 35. And the other question was, would you mind paying £5 to come to this festival, bluntly? And 50% of them said, no problem at all. So you also had this survey out there as well. So Pride, we obviously had to say we're in financial problems, and the first thing that happens, everybody's looking at that survey and thinking, and a little coalition of organisations came together, thinking they could exploit the opportunity. I think it was called Pride UK, Pride Events UK, or Freedom UK. I can't remember. And they made a competitive application for the Pride event on the same day, the licence with Lambeth Council on the same day. And we therefore had to have like a Mexican standoff almost, where we would present what it was that we intended to do and the people we were working with. And that would, bring some money, and it would also pay off the creditors. Or this organisation, which is brand new, etc. And then just before the hearing before the papers went to the council, they announced, Pride Events UK announced that one of their partners or directors was Harvey Goldsmith, the leading British concert manager. And of course that added an enormous amount of credibility to what they were saying, what they were doing. And I don't actually think it went to the licensing committee. I mean, it's a little bit of a murky thing that happened inside Lambeth. But anyway, it was scrutinised by the officials. So there was actually an interview process where they interviewed the Pride Trust applicants and the Pride UK applicants. And then there was silence for a bit. And then they said, no, we've decided to give it to Pride Events. And that was the end of it. So from the point of view of the Pride Trust, it was sunk. It was a very sad, I just couldn't risk it. And then the irony, the postscript to this is that 2 weeks before the Pride event, so the festival is being organised as usual, the march is being organised as well. Suddenly they announced that they were going to have to postpone the festival because it was a paying event. They were selling tickets. They were selling 100,000 tickets or something like this, and only a third of them had been sold 2 weeks before the event. And they postponed it to, I think it was originally August. But of course, everybody else was like, well, no, Pride should be taking place in June. So there was then a coalition of organisations, again led by Stonewall and Outrage, to organise the Pride March, which they weren't interested in the festival, the Pride March on that day. And that went ahead. They then later on, so there was a march but no festival. So they then later on said, actually, we can't do it. We're bankrupt as well. And the reason why was because Harvey Goldsmith, who was actually not a director, I think, or planning to be involved in the management of the festival, he looked at the books. His role was actually to underwrite the ticket sales, and because you don't get the ticket money until the event has taken place. And he said, I'm not going to underwrite this. And he had to pull his money out, and they had to stop it. And that's why Prides afterwards took on the name Mardi Gras for a while in London, because the organisers, Barry Jackson, I think, was one of the leading characters in this, sort of activist in the character in the community. He sort of said, well, Pride has actually had its brand damaged as a result of all of this. So we will have Mardi Gras from now onwards. And we had Mardi Gras for a few years, and of course now we've gone back to Pride again. For many years I sort of looked back on that and I was like really bitter about the way it all turned out. But actually now I kind of think, well, I think every era gets the Pride it kind of deserves. And we needed ones that were really big. And it's also really good that Prides are kind of designed to go bankrupt, because basically it clears out all the people who are organising it. A whole new bunch of new people come in, and they've got lots of fresh ideas, and they're much more with their finger on the pulse. And I think that's very clear at the moment as well, if I may say so, when it comes to Pride in London and the Reclaim the Pride event campaign that goes on. I think this is absolutely what needs to happen, is that the organising of this very important community activity needs to be handed on to the next generation, and every generation gets the Pride they deserve because they design it, I think. So it's a long journey to get to sort of like where Pride is now, I think. But the basics are always the same. It's always about queer people organising themselves, and it has an element of protest, and it has an element of party about it. It's inevitable, and long may it remain.
Hi, hello, this is Darren Brown. I just wanted to say I was one of the first people to have Danny come and film my parents for me. And it was one of the best things I think I've ever done. It was a really beautiful thing. It's a very discreet, lovely, gentle process. My mum and dad loved it. I actually did the interviewing, and sometimes Danny does that, but it was quite nice to do that myself. And I interviewed them both, and then together, and left everything in the hands of Danny, and he created this beautiful set of films, which I've now got forever. And with a young nephew growing up, it's going to be a wonderful way at some point for him to get to know his grandparents, and it will always be a beautiful thing to have. And the act of listening to their stories, quite aside from preserving them, but actually just listening to them and spending time with them and asking those questions and digging deep into their background and just finding out things that I didn't know was really wonderful. And now I've got a record of that forever. I really, really recommend it. It's a lovely afternoon. They are the nicest guys to have in your house. And it's Danny himself who comes over and does it, and clearly loves doing it too. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did, and it comes to mean as much to you as it did to me. Thanks.
Hello, darlings. Do you know of someone fabulous itching to join our sassy adventure? Don't keep it a secret. We're on the lookout for more stars to light up our video podcast. Get in touch with us today. Stay fabulous, subscribe, and let resilience reign supreme. Now let's get back to the show, darlings.
It's very difficult to say what kind of impact Section 28 actually had. I think it's like everybody says about it. It was a self-censoring thing. So there was in fact no impact, except there was a gap. There was a lack of support for young gay people, young gay teenagers. There was a lack of support or a lack of empathy for same-sex couples and things of that kind. So I think that's certainly for me. The impact, as it were, of Section 28 was to make me into an activist. That's what it actually did, and that's what made me want to be a sister, but also wanted to be involved in a group of people who were campaigning and fighting back. I think that was the sense of it. You sense of powerlessness. It's very interesting because quite a lot of friends of mine now say things like, "Oh, you did so much work. I didn't do any of that," and I feel so guilty and this sort of thing. I said, "Don't." It's like they just didn't feel it the way I did. They probably did feel it, but I could see a way of turning that and using it to empower myself, and I sort of had an internal idea that I could empower myself, but I do it with others. It's like you work with someone. I think there's a lot of activists from that time. None of the activists were working on their own. They were all working together. They were all linked in some way or another. When you sort of watch films about Peter Tatchell and things like that, he wasn't the only activist. There were lots of others. But of course, he has perhaps put himself out there more than anyone else. I think if you're a young gay person, it's great to find out that people behaved a bit like you are behaving, like 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 20 years ago or whatever. That is just great to find out, And certainly when I was a young gay man, I was fascinated by the fact that there were these old guys sitting in pubs talking in Polari. I had no idea what was going on. But it was only later I realised that this was actually something that's unique and historic in my inheritance, as it were, and it needs to be kept and rescued and saved. And I also feel also about the 90s is that, as I said before, this idea of queer politics is so misunderstood now. I think what we were doing is now seen through a lens by perhaps younger queer historians, and it's not strictly what it was we were doing, if you see what I mean. I don't think we had a big grand plan. We didn't have the benefit of hindsight looking back over the 90s and seeing that this was, but we felt at the time that this was a movement. It was clearly something was happening, but we weren't quite sure what it was. We just felt that we were getting stronger. We were getting stronger against the government or against politics or against the law, and it was inevitably going to change. And along comes the concept of New Labour and Tony Blair and him being very much on side. And I think that that's really, honestly, what everybody was heading towards. They knew that that's what they had to have happen. So I have to say something about Pride. We would work flat out as volunteers. We weren't paid at all. And I had a job. And my job finished at sort of 5 o'clock, and I would get on a tube and I would travel down to Brixton to the Pride office and would do probably another 4 hours of work there before then travelling home. And my home was actually in North London, so Brixton, South London. I'm in North London. I'm travelling back up, like 40 minutes backwards and forwards. I look back on it now, I just can't believe I did it. It was like having 2.5 jobs every day, especially as it got near the event. But because I was so involved, and the job I was doing was absolutely no job at all. It was like I think it was I was the office manager of a design group. I mean, nothing, and that was making it possible for me to do this other stuff. So I sort of ended up with all these skills in managing events, because if you run something which is twice the size of Glastonbury, it does rub off. You know stuff. And that's where I went. I actually then thought, I'll get myself a job in the events world. And I did. So I started working with, first of all, with world music, as we call it, world music from other countries, and touring that and being involved in that. They then moved into working with commercial festivals, outdoor events. There's one that's very well known, which was called The Big Chill. Everybody remembers it. So it's a heritage organisation. But then I also worked with the Green Man Festival, which is still going strong. And I had this background as being a producer and so on. That made it possible for me to join the British Council. And I started working with the British Council in about 2000. So Pride folded in 97, and I was in the British Council in 2000 for about 5 years. And then through that, again, doing event work, it was moving on from specific LGBTQ community to working in community settings in the UK and overseas. So I'm very interested in how artists work with local communities and reflect the life of local communities in their art, cross-sectoral working in that pure sense. And I started then working with an organisation based in Stockholm in Sweden, which was called Intercult. And it works with interculturalism. And interculturalism, which is a bit of a step forward and a bit more proactive than multiculturalism, is about not this kind of like, here's my thing, I'll show you, you show me yours, we value it. We're actually going to really work together, and we're actually going to explore points of contact and points of conflict and points of creativity. It's really sort of like bringing people together and sort of seeing what happens. And I found it very, very fruitful and stimulating. When I worked with them, we were funded by the European Union to do what they call transnational cultural projects. And I've been very lucky and worked all the way through Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Romania, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, and also around the Nordic space as well, so in places like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and so on, and in the UK. And that was a really, I think, quite fulfilling experience. But it's always using the Pride stuff. It's always about how do you bring groups together? How do you get organisations to work? Pride was entirely volunteers. You had to break the work up into little bits because you want a volunteer to have an experience that will see it through and find it satisfying and so on. So you do the same with a big project, make sure that everybody's got something that they can fulfill and bring together. we were working remotely because before anybody had COVID or anything like that, I was always using Skype. Skype in those days, to talk to people. My team was sort of spread out across Europe. There was about 1,000 kilometers between me and some of them. It was a really sort of interesting time to bring all these kind of organizational experiences I had to put it into something like this. And now I'm working as a funder, so I'm working in the Arts Council. And I've always done this sort of swapping backwards and forwards from the British Council to producing, to the Arts Council, to doing other things. It's just try and keep my hand in. And in personal life, I have a partner who's a new partner, who's significantly younger than me. My relationships, in the early 90s, they were always clouded by this sort of safer sex question. One of my early partners was HIV positive, and I learned a lot from them. About the emotional and mental experiences that they were having as part being HIV positive, and also in terms of Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, who I work with, were very close friends of mine. One in particular was Simon Kennett, who was, I hope I can say this, Sister Jack off all trade master of nuns, who sadly passed away in 1997. Of AIDS-related illness. I mean, I think a man of my age, somebody of my age, cannot possibly have escaped. There was another sister, Sister Melancholia and Thou, David Davis, died also, and worked a lot with Pride as well. And my own cousin, actually, David, died in the States. So it's something it was very much also a turning point for my mother when her nephew died. She rang me up and she said, are you all right? She was like, the first time almost that she'd had that conversation with me. And I said, yes, I'm perfectly fine. It was like, what else am I going to say? And in latter life, where she died suddenly, actually, in 2009 of a heart attack. And I pretty soon realized that my father had dementia, and she had kind of concealed it. So I then, from 2009, for about 6 years, had to care for my dad as well. That actually severely limited the opportunities to have relationships, because there was so much that had to be sorted out with Dad. I mean, I still am quite angry about the way that the system does not, or didn't then, I don't know if it does now, facilitate single carers and things like that in those circumstances. Anyway, he lived with me for a while, and then we found him somewhere to live, and he passed away in 2015. And from my own, I mean, I've been a Londoner, born and bred all my life. And, I know London inside out. I thought I'd made a choice to move out of London. So I'm now living on the Kent coast. And that's a completely different lifestyle and headspace as well for me. And I've moved to Folkestone, which is up the road from Dungeness. And in fact, there's a cultural organisation in Folkestone called the Creative Foundation that manages Derek Jarman's cottage, ironically. And what is it now? It was just after the pandemic, so we're talking about 2021. A filmmaker called Marco Alessi got in touch with the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, who canonised Derek Jarman, and said he would very much like to make a film, including the canonization, not about the canonization, including it. And would we help him recreate the canonization? And we said yes. So we had a meeting with him on Skype. And during the course of the conversation, there was a light bulb moment for him. He was saying, this could be a documentary. He was like, realized that he was going to make his own film. It's a beautiful film, actually, called The Bower. But he also thought, I'm going to make a documentary about why the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence canonized Derek Jarman. So for the first time in years, I mean, I can't remember when the last time was that I manifested as Sister Gloria, along with several of the other sisters. And we all came together, and we recorded our memories of the time, and it was turned into a Guardian documentary called Saint Making, which is available on your browser. And in this documentary, we tell the story also of Simon Kennett, our Simon, about how he was part of our gang, and it was a way of memorializing him, because we were really feeling that it was 2021. It was 30 years since the canonization in 1991. That was one of the reasons why we thought we'd do it. And we have Marco has donated all the outtakes, all the video, to the Bishopsgate Institute as part of the donation that the sisters have made to the Bishopsgate. And we're hoping that there will be lots of other sisters out there who will also make a donation as well. So there was a very nice way to sort of round up that whole thing. And then now, I'm sort of like quite keen to be a sister again. And, we are trying to restart the London House, and there's a few postulants who've come forward, and we're just sort of grooming them. So you never know, there might be a rebirth at some point. I have to say, there's lots of sisters all over the country. There's loads of sisters everywhere. You'd be surprised. Manchester and Edinburgh and everywhere else. So we'll be coming back.
Thank you for tuning in to our video podcast series, Voices of Resilience. We trust that you found this episode both enlightening and enjoyable. Here at Silver Screen Family, we are driven by the conviction that every individual harbours unique stories that deserve to be preserved. This belief fuels our passion for creating films that capture the wisdom and experiences of our elders, ensuring that their legacy is etched in our memories for generations to come. If you would like to immortalize someone's story through film, why not get in touch with us today? We would be honored to help you create a lasting tribute.